Now, this idea of direct democracy, for the most part, I think that our sort of intuitive response to this is a good thing. That people have more of a say in the government is a good thing. And so, I mean, at first, is that the general sense that it's a good idea for citizens to have more say in the government? But there are some criticisms about this direct democracy. One of them is kind of implied in what I was talking about. You get these weird situations where your choice is between an old movie star, the governor, a porn star, somebody who should have retired as a star many years ago, Gary Coleman, a comedian. It's like there's a lack of seriousness about it sometimes. But there are some more fundamental criticisms that are not unique to how bizarre California is. A lot of times the issues that are put on the ballot are extremely complicated. Not too long ago, there was an initiative that was put on the ballot through this direct democracy approach that had to do with converting from using mostly fossil fuels to natural gas. And part of this proposition was involved taking many of the cars that were owned by the state of California and converting them over to cars that were run on natural gas. And there were a whole bunch of issues that were involved in that. The costs associated with that, does it pay off? What are the benefits in terms of the environment versus do we go more in debt? How in debt are we? There are all these kind of complicated issues that wind up on the ballot. There was one not on the last ballot that had to do with the reorganization of the legislature and changing the rules by which the budget is passed. These are really complicated issues. There have been a couple of issues where every election cycle, what I do is I go with my neighbors. I also did it on campus last time, but I'll get my neighbors around and I'll go through each of the propositions on the ballot and I'll explain it to them. I'm the political scientist on the block, so my neighbors will come over and I'll explain each of the propositions because they can be quite complicated. And there have been a couple of them where I look at the text just of the proposition itself. It'll be like 25 pages long of this very complicated legalese language. It's like, how are we as citizens supposed to make sense of this? How are we supposed to understand the implications of changing the rules on the way budgets are passed in the state legislature? Most people don't even know what the state legislature is, let alone understand the rules. So there's some criticism that, given how complicated the issues are, leaving this decision in the hands of the voters is probably not a good idea. In many ways, we're not qualified. We're not qualified to make these decisions. The other concern is that moneyed interests have too much power in this situation. That people who have a big financial interest are the ones who can go ahead and afford to pay people to stand in front of supermarkets and do those kinds of things to get the signatures, to get things on the ballot. Like, you remember the one I was just telling you guys before about that switched over all California cars from they're called fleet cars. Those are the cars that are owned by the state of California. It was going to switch them over from using fossil fuel, regular gasoline, to natural gas. And that seems like a relatively good idea, right? It's cleaner air, all that kind of stuff. But the guy who was going ahead and paying who paid to get the signature signed, also, by coincidence, happens to be the guy who controls natural gas in California. T. Boone Pickens is his name. And if all the state vehicles were going to switch over to natural gas, guess who was going to be supplying them with the natural gas? Him. So he had these really cool commercials on TV talking about the importance of this, and it's probably a good idea to get away from fossil fuels in one way or another at some point or another. But in this case, it was because this guy had a boatload of money. He could afford to pay to get the signatures signed. He could go ahead and pay to have the commercials put on. He could go ahead and pay for the whole thing, and this creates a problem. Sort of gets back to the idea that people aren't particularly knowledgeable. We don't really know that much oftentimes. And so this is another danger that people express about direct democracy.
Is there a conflict of interest that he's the advisor of that committee?
That he's the guy who benefits from it?
Yeah.
He's a citizen of California. So he can go ahead and he can have somebody who's in California do it. So it's not a conflict of interest. The citizens can propose whatever they want. So if he goes and he comes to you, he says, hey, look, I want to pass this initiative and I'd like you to head up the drive since you're a Californian. And he says, and I'm going to give you $1 million to do it. It's like, well, let's go, right? I'll be in front of Ralph's if you need me, right? The direct democracy, you can do that. You can do that. And so there's a concern that people who have money, that's what I mean by money and interest, have too much power and too much influence in this process. And then the last concern, it says, violates the spirit of compromise. That when you go through the legislative branch, and you guys know now how a bill becomes a law, we've talked about it at the federal level, well, the process is almost exactly the same at the state level. It's that same process of going through a subcommittee, then to a committee, then passing the assembly, is what it's called in the California government. Then you go to the state senate and go through the same process. Then you go to the governor. It's all that same difficult process, and that requires a lot of compromise to get anything done. In a case of a ballot initiative, you don't have to compromise with anybody. You don't have to do anything. You say, this is what I want to do. To hell with everybody else. And you go ahead and you try and get that law passed, disregarding what anybody else thinks. No need to try and compromise. All you're going to do is try and get people to sign on to your idea. And if you can get 50% plus one, it becomes a law. And so there are other people who say that this direct democracy, although again, whereas I say generally speaking, I think most people feel like the more power that we have as individuals, the better off we are, the more say we are. That would probably be true if citizens were involved, if citizens paid attention, if citizens were informed. But that just isn't the case. And so there are a lot of people who find this part of our democracy here in California problematic. And there have been cases where propositions have been passed that have been, I'm expressing an opinion here, but I will, and I'll even do it filming it, that have been wrong, that have been bad. Even propositions that were unconstitutional, that everybody knew when they were being voted on were unconstitutional. They still got on the ballot, and they still went ahead and got passed, and then somebody sued, and the courts declared them unconstitutional. A while back, way before you guys were around, back when I was still plumbing, so before I was even in political science, California's passed something called Proposition 187. And what Proposition 187 said was that anybody who was an illegal alien in California could get zero government services. And that means if you had kids, if you were an illegal alien, you had kids here, they couldn't go to schools. It meant if you went to a hospital, if you were in a car accident and you went to a hospital, they could not provide you services. Now, when that went ahead and passed, people were saying, this is dumb because this is unconstitutional. This will never fly. And yet, the proponents of Proposition 187 put the commercials on, made the argument, we need to get these people out of here, which may or may not be a legitimate argument, but the idea of denying people the right to medical services just wasn't going to happen in the state of California or anywhere in this country, and it still got passed. So there are times when this process is used where it's like, people don't always show the best judgment. And it's nice to know that we have this power. Don't get me wrong. I kind of like the fact that we have it. But the flip side of it, the bad side of it, is something worth keeping in mind. Are there any questions about that? Go ahead, Nate.
Was this before people were allowed to become naturalized citizens? Like if your parents were immigrants to here, like you were born here, would you still be able to be a citizen of the United States, or would that Prop 187 tell you that way?
It would know if you're born here in the United States. So if two people come over here illegally and they have a child, that child is born here in the United States, that person is an American citizen, right, because they're born here. But if that mom is pregnant and needs to go to the hospital, then Proposition 187 would say she couldn't get medical services.
Right. Would the kid also be?
The kid would still be able to get it because the kid would be a citizen.
Okay.
So this is what it was, and it's been used in these ways before, where something gets passed that it's just clearly unconstitutional, and this is one of the problems with the direct democracy. So just want to, because I know you guys know the positive end of it. I just want to make sure that you guys know the negative end. So one of the questions that I might ask on an exam would be, what are some of the criticisms about direct democracy in California? Okay, you guys feel like you could answer that question? Ashley? I'd like to pause. Like, let me reflect on that. Okay, very good.